Above all, don't lie to yourself. The man who lies to himself can easily lose the ability to distinguish truth around him. Dostoevsky. Imagine being in a conversation where every word the person speaks seems to be carefully filtered, where every story sounds like an edited version of reality, where you realize you're not talking to a genuine human being, but to a performative version of themselves. Have you ever experienced this? Have you ever felt like you were in front of someone desperately fighting to convince themselves of something they didn't completely believe? If so, you've just experienced one of the most disturbing phenomena of the human psyche: systematic self-deception. This is an almost artistic ability we have to lie to ourselves with such mastery that we forget where truth ends and fantasy begins. The pain you feel when recognizing these moments is no coincidence. Your perception is capturing something deeply wrong, a dissonance that echoes in the deepest layers of human experience. When someone lies to themselves, they create a kind of tension field around that person, an atmosphere of unreality that sensitive people detect instantly. You're not imagining things, you're not being paranoid or overly critical. You're simply tuned into a frequency of perception that most people prefer to ignore. And this, paradoxically, can be both a gift and a burden. Dostoevsky, the Russian master of the human soul, dedicated his literary life to dissecting exactly this phenomenon. In Notes from Underground, he created a protagonist who became the universal archetype of the man who hides from his own truth. This character not only lies to others, he constructs elaborate rationalizations to escape painful truths about himself, creating layers upon layers of justifications until the original reality disappears under piles of convenient narratives. Dostoevsky understood something that modern psychology would only begin to comprehend decades later: that the human mind is capable of impressive feats of emotional self-preservation, even if it means living in a prison of illusions. What you'll discover in the next few minutes are not just social observation techniques, but emotional protection tools that can revolutionize how you navigate your relationships. Because when you learn to identify the subtle signs of self-deception, you gain a silent superpower: the ability to distinguish between who is being genuine and who is playing a role, even unconsciously. This doesn't make you cynical or distrustful. It makes you strategic, conscious, protected. Let's explore together the 8 signs that Dostoevsky mapped through his most complex characters, signs that reveal when someone is fleeing from their own reality. Each of these patterns represents a specific form of psychological self-defense, a particular way of avoiding truths that the person isn't yet ready to face. And perhaps at the end of this journey, you'll not only learn to protect your emotional energy, but also develop more compassion for those individuals who carry the immense weight of living disconnected from themselves. Prepare yourself for an experience that can forever change how you see and interact with the people around you. Because once you learn to see these patterns, there's no going back. Have you ever found yourself in a conversation where someone turns a simple decision into a 20-minute presentation? Where someone explains in detail why they chose that restaurant, that outfit, that route home, even though you didn't even ask? If you're a perceptive person, you've probably already felt that silent discomfort that arises when someone over-justifies, when explanations seem too long, too elaborate, as if the person were trying to convince not just you, but mainly themselves. This phenomenon isn't coincidence or excessive politeness. It's something much deeper and more revealing, an almost desperate compulsion to align emotional decisions with rational narratives, even when that connection simply doesn't exist. Think about the people around you. How many do you know who seem to live explaining their choices, creating complex theories about why they did what they did? The protagonist of Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground is a perfect portrait of this dynamic. He spends pages justifying behaviors that lasted seconds, building elaborate philosophies to explain why he acted cowardly in a banal situation. Each justification becomes more sophisticated than the previous one, each rationalization more complex, until you realize you're facing a mind at war with itself. The underground man isn't trying to deceive the reader. He's trying to build a bearable version of himself to continue living. Now reflect on your own experiences. Have you ever known that person who spends half their salary on an impulsive purchase and then lists 17 practical reasons why that was a smart investment? Or that acquaintance who accepts a job they clearly hate and builds a manifesto about financial stability and responsibility, when you suspect the real motivation was simply fear of taking risks? Here's something you might never have noticed. The more elaborate the justification, the greater, usually, is the distance between the real decision and the constructed narrative. It's as if the unconscious mind knew something was misaligned with the choice, and therefore needs to work overtime to make it acceptable. Have you ever noticed how people genuinely connected to their values rarely feel the need to explain their decisions excessively? They do, assume, and move on. But what about those trapped in self-deception? They live in a constant state of internal advocacy, always defending a case that even they haven't completely bought. When you interact with someone like this, you're witnessing a mind that made decisions based on impulses, fears, unprocessed traumas, but then needs to create a rational architecture so the person can look at themselves in the mirror. Have you ever noticed how these conversations leave you feeling? Probably with a strange sensation, as if something didn't add up, as if you were listening to a theater play instead of a genuine conversation. And you're right to feel that. When someone over-justifies, they're asking for permission, not from you, but from a part of themselves that knows that choice isn't aligned with who they really are or aspire to be. The question that remains is, how do you deal with this? How do you navigate relationships with people who live in this constant mental theater, always explaining, always rationalizing, always building castles of logic on foundations of emotional sand? And perhaps more importantly, how many times have you yourself fallen into this trap without realizing it? Have you ever found yourself in one of those conversations where you feel like you're talking to two completely different people at the same time? Where someone tells you something with total conviction and 5 minutes later, acts completely opposite without showing even a glimmer of self-awareness about this incoherence? If you've experienced this, congratulations. You've just witnessed one of the most fascinating and disturbing manifestations of human self-deception, the ability to simultaneously inhabit contradictory realities without this causing any mental discomfort. Raskolnikov, the protagonist of Crime and Punishment, is perhaps the most powerful example of this dynamic in world literature. Dostoevsky created a character who builds an elaborate philosophy about superior men who are above common morality, intellectually justifying murder as an almost altruistic act. Simultaneously, this same man is consumed by devastating guilt that makes him waste away physically, tremble with terror, and unconsciously seek ways to turn himself into justice. His rational mind says one thing, his body and unconscious say exactly the opposite, and he remains completely oblivious to this internal war until it completely destroys him. Now think about the people around you. How many times have you heard someone close speak passionately about work-life balance while answering emails at 3 in the morning? Do you know someone who claims to be extremely spiritual and connected to higher values, but destroys relationships with calculated coldness whenever they don't get what they want? Or perhaps that friend who talks incessantly about authenticity and being real, while carefully constructing a public image that you know has nothing to do with who they really are. When you're alone together, the question you should ask yourself is, why can't these people see what's so obvious to you? The answer will surprise you. The psychological mechanism behind this blindness isn't stupidity or bad faith. It's a sophisticated mental architecture that creates hermetic compartments for conflicting information. Imagine that these people's minds function like a building with dozens of isolated rooms, where each contradiction lives in a separate compartment, with walls so thick that sounds from one side never reach the other. Have you ever tried to point out these contradictions to someone? If so, you probably discovered something frustrating. The more obvious the incoherence to you, the more defensive and even aggressive the person becomes when you mention the subject. Why? Because you're not simply pointing out a logical error. You're threatening an entire system of psychological survival. For that person, keeping these contradictions separate isn't optional. It's essential to continue functioning without emotionally collapsing. Think about this for a moment. If you were forced to confront all your own contradictions at once, if all the different versions of who you are had to meet in a room and come to an agreement about which is the real one, could you handle that? Most of us have at least some areas where we prefer to keep reality a bit nebulous. Some corners of personality we prefer not to illuminate with too bright a light. The difference lies in the extent and rigidity of these mechanisms. Some people have developed such elaborate systems of self-preservation that they live in completely disconnected parallel realities. And when you learn to identify this pattern, an uncomfortable truth emerges. Trying to fix these contradictions by pointing them out directly is not only useless but can be cruel. These people aren't pretending not to see. They genuinely can't see, at least not yet, not without professional help or a crisis that forces the meeting of these separate realities. The question that remains is, how do you protect your own mental sanity when you need to deal with someone living in this state of split? How do you maintain functional relationships with people who can tell you one thing in the morning and do exactly the opposite in the afternoon without any sense of incoherence? Have you ever lived with someone who seems to always be in a crisis, where every small setback transforms into an epic catastrophe, where a casual comment becomes a devastating offense, where problems you would solve in 5 minutes become dramas that consume entire weeks of emotional energy? If you're a balanced person, you've probably wondered why certain people seem to attract or amplify conflicts so disproportionately. The truth is that you're not witnessing bad luck or excessive sensitivity. You're observing a sophisticated psychological mechanism of reality escape. When someone systematically dramatizes small problems, they're unconsciously creating emotional distractions to avoid facing much larger and more frightening issues that inhabit the depths of their psyche. Dostoevsky was a master at portraying characters who become hysterical over trivial matters while completely ignoring their own destruction. Think of Dmitri Karamazov, who despairs over small debts and matters of social honor while his entire life crumbles around him. Or the multiple characters in Demons who get involved in elaborate political intrigues to avoid confronting the existential void consuming them from within. When you observe this pattern in real life, you're seeing something fascinating. The human mind consciously choosing to suffer over something small and controllable, instead of facing something big and scary. It's easier to have a crisis because of a WhatsApp comment than to admit you hate your career. It's more comfortable to dramatize a conflict with a neighbor than to recognize that your marriage died years ago. It's less threatening to cry over a high bill than to face the reality that you're living a life you didn't choose. Have you noticed how these people always have a situation preventing deeper reflections? There's always an emergency, always someone who hurt them, always an urgent problem that needs all available emotional attention. And when one drama resolves, magically another appears to take its place. It's as if the mind had a genuine horror of silence, those empty moments where deeper thoughts could emerge. What you're witnessing isn't natural dramaticity or intense personality. It's an unconscious strategy of self-preservation. These people have developed an infallible radar for finding external problems that justify their internal suffering. They're not inventing the pain they feel, but they're directing all this emotional energy towards safe targets, problems that can be solved without questioning fundamental structures of their lives. Think about how this affects you when you live with someone like this. You probably feel exhausted, as if you were constantly putting out fires, always reacting to the next crisis, always trying to calm, always being pulled into that person's emotional whirlwind. And when you suggest a broader perspective or question whether maybe the problem isn't so serious, you become the insensitive one, the one who doesn't understand, the one who doesn't care. The tragedy is that the more you try to help by solving the superficial dramas, the more you feed the system. Because these people don't really want to solve the small problems, they need them to maintain the psychological architecture that protects them from bigger and scarier truths. Have you noticed how practical and simple solutions to their problems are frequently ignored or rejected? How they prefer to keep the problem and the justification for suffering? The question you should ask yourself is, how many times have you been sucked into these emotional theaters? How many times have you spent energy trying to solve problems that exist not to be solved? And perhaps more importantly, can you recognize moments in your own life where you yourself created minor dramas to avoid facing bigger issues that scared you? Have you ever lived through that uncomfortable moment where you mentioned something completely obvious to someone, and the person reacted as if you had attacked their family, where a neutral comment, a gentle observation, or even a misdirected compliment triggered an emotional explosion totally disproportionate? If you're someone who pays attention to the details of human behavior, you've probably wondered why certain simple truths provoke such violent reactions in some people. What you witnessed in those moments wasn't excessive sensitivity or difficult personality. It was a psychological defense mechanism operating in emergency mode. When someone reacts with disproportionate aggressiveness to simple truths, you've just touched, even unintentionally, on a wound that person isn't ready to acknowledge yet. It's as if you had turned on a light in a room they deliberately keep in the dark. Dostoevsky captured this dynamic with surgical precision in his characters. In The Brothers Karamazov, Ivan reacts with fury when someone simply suggests he might care more about his father than he admits. In Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov panics when people make casual observations that come too close to his hidden guilt. The disproportionate reaction isn't about the comment itself. It's about the unconscious terror that someone might be seeing through their carefully constructed defenses. Think about your own experiences. Do you know people who explode when someone mentions they work too much, that they seem lonely, that they might be stressed? That acquaintance who gets offended when you observe with the best intentions that they seem tired or worried? Or perhaps that person who becomes defensive and even hostile when someone comments on obvious patterns in their behavior. The uncomfortable truth is that the more aggressive the reaction to a simple observation, the closer you came to something the person is desperately trying to hide from themselves. It's as if they knew, on a deep unconscious level, that you touched on something real, something true, something they don't yet have the courage to face. The aggressiveness isn't about you. It's about the terror of being seen, of being known, of having to confront aspects of themselves they prefer to keep in the shadows. Have you noticed how these explosions frequently include phrases like, "You don't know me," "You don't know what you're talking about," or "You have no right to judge me"? These reactions reveal something fascinating. The person is fighting not against your observation, but against the possibility that you might be right. They're not defending their reputation. They're defending a version of themselves that needs to remain untouched for them to continue functioning. The most revealing thing of all is that these people frequently return days later to apologize for the misunderstanding, but rarely to acknowledge that maybe you touched on a valid point. The apology comes for the explosion, never for the underlying issue. It's as if they need to clear the air emotionally without ever examining what caused the storm. When you learn to identify this pattern, an uncomfortable perception emerges. You have a silent power you didn't even know you possessed. Your casual observations, your apparently innocent comments, can function as truth detectors, revealing exactly where a person's unhealed wounds are. And this puts you in a delicate position, because now you know that some simple truths are emotional grenades in disguise. The question that remains is, how do you navigate relationships knowing that certain people live in psychological minefields? How do you maintain genuine conversations when you realize that many apparently innocent topics can trigger explosions? And perhaps more importantly, can you recognize areas in your own life where you react disproportionately when someone touches on truths you're not yet ready to face? Have you ever noticed how certain people tell the same story in completely different ways depending on who's listening? We're not talking about small adjustments or distinct emphasis, but fundamental changes in facts, motivations, even outcomes. A person tells how they were brave in a situation to one group, but portrays themselves as a victim of the same situation to another. Details transform, villains and heroes switch roles, and the story's moral changes completely according to the audience. If you're observant, you've probably experienced that disturbing moment where you hear the same person tell the same story in ways so different that you wonder if they're talking about the same event. And when you mention the inconsistencies, the person shows not even a glimmer of embarrassment or self-awareness. They genuinely seem to believe each version at the moment they tell it. Dostoevsky was fascinated by this human capacity to rewrite their own history. In Demons, characters recount the same events in radically different ways to different people, not because they're deliberately lying, but because each version serves a specific psychological need. Each narrative protects a different facet of the self-image they need to keep intact to continue functioning. What you're witnessing in these moments is something more complex than common lying. It's the mind editing memories in real time to maintain an internal coherence that never truly existed. Think about it. When someone needs to be seen as courageous, the story emphasizes moments of bravery. When they need compassion, the same events are retold highlighting suffering. When seeking admiration, the focus goes to achievements and successes that might have been much less significant in reality. Do you know people like this? That acquaintance who tells some friends how assertive they were in a meeting but describes the same meeting as a traumatic experience where they were wrong to others? Or that person who alternates between portraying themselves as victim or hero of the same situation, depending on what they need to get from each conversation? The most disturbing discovery about this pattern is that these people aren't consciously manipulating truth. They're living multiple truths simultaneously. Each version of the story is genuine at the moment it's told, because each one feeds a different emotional need. The mind becomes like a skilled editor, cutting and pasting pieces of reality to create narratives that serve specific purposes. What this reveals about the nature of memory and identity is both fascinating and frightening. These people have developed the ability to inhabit different versions of themselves according to need, like actors interpreting distinct roles in the same mental theater. Each audience receives the performance that confirms the identity version they need to project at that moment. When you recognize this pattern, an uncomfortable question emerges. How reliable are the stories these people tell about you? If they edit their own experiences so easily, what happens when you become part of their narratives? You could be the hero in one version, the villain in another, depending on what the story needs to serve in each context. The trap for perceptive people like you is trying to find the true version of the story, as if there were an objective reality that could be discovered if you put all the pieces together. But the deeper truth is that, for these people, the true version is always the one they're telling at the moment, because it's the one that serves their psychological needs at that specific instant. The question you need to ask yourself is, how do you protect your own perception of reality when you live with someone who lives in fluid narratives? How do you maintain your own sanity when you participate in relationships where basic facts about shared experiences are constantly being rewritten, and perhaps more uncomfortable? How many times have you yourself already adjusted details of your own stories to fit what you needed to project in different situations? Have you ever noticed how certain people seem to live in a constant thirst for approval? As if, without the gaze and confirmation of others, they simply cease to exist. If you're an introspective person, you've probably already questioned this phenomenon, and maybe even recognize echoes of it in moments of your own life. That whispering voice that asks if what you did was good enough, if your choices have value, if you deserve admiration. Dostoevsky captured this dynamic with devastating precision in characters who live according to others' gaze. Think of the protagonist of Notes from Underground, who exists almost entirely through the reactions he provokes in people, who builds his identity based on others' approval or rejection. Or many characters in Demons, who become puppets of their own recognition needs, completely losing contact with genuine desires and values. When you observe people trapped in this pattern, you're witnessing something deeper than vanity or common insecurity. You're seeing someone who developed a psychological dependence on external validation because they lost, or never developed, the ability to validate themselves internally. It's as if they outsourced their self-esteem, handing over control of how they feel about themselves to whoever happens to be around. Do you know people like this? Those who live posting on social media, not to share genuine moments, but to harvest likes as a way of confirming they exist? Or perhaps that acquaintance who turns every conversation into an opportunity for self-promotion, who constantly needs to tell their conquests, successes, merits, as if constantly accounting to an invisible jury. What makes this pattern particularly tragicomic is that these people frequently become slaves to audiences they don't even truly respect. They adapt their opinions, modify their behaviors, even alter fundamental aspects of their personality based on feedback from people they might not even know well or care about in other circumstances. Have you noticed how these people seem to have no consistent self when alone, as if they always needed a social mirror to know who they are? When there's no audience, there's no performance, and when there's no performance, it seems there's no person. It's a hauntingly empty existence where identity becomes completely dependent on external and volatile factors. The cruelest trap of this dynamic is that the hunger for validation can never be truly satisfied. Each dose of approval offers only temporary relief, creating an even greater need for the next confirmation. It's like a psychological drug where tolerance constantly increases. You need more and more validation to feel the same level of satisfaction, until your entire life revolves around this search. And when validation doesn't come, or worse, when criticism or indifference comes, the emotional breakdown is disproportionate, because there's no solid internal foundation to cushion the impact. The person who depends on external approval lives on a constant emotional roller coaster, where their mood and self-esteem fluctuate drastically based on factors completely outside their control. When you interact with someone trapped in this pattern, you probably feel a subtle but constant pressure to be the source of validation this person needs. You become audience, judge, mirror, anything but an equal in a genuine relationship. And if you don't provide the expected approval, you quickly become the insensitive one, the one who doesn't understand, the one being unfair. The question you should ask yourself is, how do you protect your own authenticity when you live with people who live according to others' approval? How do you maintain balanced relationships when one party constantly needs external confirmation to function? And perhaps the most uncomfortable question, in how many moments of your own life have you caught yourself seeking external validation instead of cultivating a solid relationship with yourself? Have you ever noticed how certain people have an almost pathological aversion to silence? Not external silence, many even say they like peace and tranquility, but internal silence, those empty moments where there's nothing between them and their own thoughts. If you're observant, you've probably already noticed people who seem to live in constant flight from this encounter with themselves, filling every available second with external stimuli, as if mental emptiness were an existential threat. Dostoevsky explored this dynamic with disturbing depth. His most complex characters discover that true loneliness isn't physical, but psychological. It's being alone with truths about themselves they're not yet ready to face. The underground man, for example, lives in constant dialectic with himself, but is incapable of bearing the insights that emerge from this internal conversation, always seeking distractions or creating dramas to avoid uncomfortable conclusions. When you observe people who can't be alone with their thoughts, you're seeing something deeper than agitation or extroverted personality. You're witnessing a sophisticated form of psychological escape, where the person has developed an unconscious aversion to what they might discover about themselves if they stop to listen to their own mind. It's as if they were afraid to discover who they really are when there's no one to impress, no role to play, no distraction to mask internal reality. Do you know people like this? Those who are always with headphones, always busy, always socializing, always consuming content, always doing something, who fill their schedule with activities not because they really want to do all these things, but because the alternative, having free time to think, is intolerable. Have you noticed how these people become visibly uncomfortable in situations where they're forced into silence, like long trips without entertainment or moments where conversation naturally ceases? What these people are avoiding aren't just negative thoughts or common worries. They're fleeing from an intimate encounter with themselves that could reveal aspects of their personality, their choices, their motivations that they're not yet prepared to confront. It could be guilt over past decisions, regret over lost opportunities, fear about the future, or simply the recognition that the life they're living isn't really the life they would choose if they were completely honest with themselves. The cruel irony of this flight is that it creates exactly what it's trying to avoid. The more a person flees from their own thoughts, the more frightening and urgent those thoughts become. It's like trying not to think about a pink bear. Suppression only intensifies what you're trying to avoid. These people frequently develop anxiety, chronic restlessness, or a persistent sensation that something is wrong without ever being able to identify what it is. When you live with someone who has this aversion to internal silence, you probably notice a frenetic quality in their energy. They may seem always busy and productive, but there's something exhausting about their presence, as if they were constantly running on an invisible treadmill. Conversations with these people frequently jump from topic to topic, rarely deepening into any subject because depth requires exactly the kind of silent reflection they're avoiding. And you? When was the last time you allowed yourself to sit in total silence, without music, without books, without phone, without any external stimulus? Just you and your own thoughts? Can you imagine doing this for an entire hour? The discomfort you might feel just considering this possibility could reveal how much our modern culture has conditioned us to avoid this essential encounter with ourselves. The truth that Dostoevsky understood is that moments of forced solitude, whether chosen or imposed by life, are frequently when his character's most profound and transformative insights emerge. It's in silence that the mind stops performing and begins to reveal. But for people trapped in self-deception, this silence isn't a sanctuary. It's a battlefield where they inevitably lose because they're fighting against truths about themselves. The question that remains is, what are you avoiding discovering about yourself? What truths might be waiting in the silent spaces between your busy thoughts? And perhaps more importantly, what is the cost of continuing to run from this intimate encounter with who you really are? Have you ever noticed how some people have an impressive facility for identifying flaws in others, especially those that reflect exactly what they can't admit about themselves? As if they possessed an internal radar, perfectly calibrated to detect in others precisely the weaknesses, fears, and failures they themselves deny or reject? If you're observant, you've probably already witnessed this disturbing dynamic, where someone vehemently criticizes characteristics you recognize in that same person. Dostoevsky was a master at portraying the psychological mechanics. In Demons, Characters attack each other for behaviors that are almost perfect mirrors of their own flaws. The underground man criticizes in others exactly the cowardice, resentment, and pettiness that define him, but can never make this connection. It's as if they were fighting against external versions of their own internal monsters, in a war that can never be won because the real battlefield is interior. When you witness these projections, you're seeing one of the most sophisticated and destructive defense mechanisms of the human mind. The person who projects their flaws isn't consciously lying or being hypocritical in the traditional sense. They've developed an almost supernatural capacity to externalize aspects of themselves they consider unacceptable, transforming them into characteristics they can fight out there without ever having to face them in here. Do you know people like this? That acquaintance who obsessively criticizes selfish people while monopolizing conversations and rarely showing genuine interest in others? Or perhaps that person who constantly attacks fake and manipulative individuals while carefully constructing different personas for different situations? The emotional intensity of these criticisms is always disproportionate because they're fighting not against the real person, but against denied aspects of themselves. Jung called this projected shadow. What we can't accept in ourselves becomes intolerable when we see it in others. It's an elegant psychological mechanism in its simplicity. Instead of doing the painful work of integrating uncomfortable aspects of one's own personality, the mind externalizes them, creating convenient enemies that can be criticized without self-reflection. What makes this dynamic particularly fascinating is its precision. The person who projects usually identifies in others exactly those flaws they possess, but with an accuracy that would be impressive if it weren't so destructive. It's as if they had developed unconscious expertise in recognizing their own failures, but only when they appear in other people. When you find yourself on the receiving end of these projections, the experience can be disconcerting and painful. The person is attacking you for characteristics you might not even possess, or is exaggerating minor aspects of your personality until transforming them into monstrous defects. Your first reaction might be to defend yourself, explain, counterattack. But here's a liberating insight. These projected criticisms reveal much more about who makes them than about you. The temptation is always to react to the content of the projection, to try to prove you're not what you're being accused of being. But you're missing the real point. The person isn't really talking about you. They're having an unconscious conversation with themselves, a conversation you can't win because you're not really part of it. And what about yourself? How many times have you caught yourself intensely criticizing in others exactly those characteristics you prefer not to examine too closely in yourself? That disproportionate irritation you feel when someone is lazy, insecure, controlling, or needy. Could it be revealing aspects of yourself that you haven't completely integrated yet? The disturbing beauty of this dynamic is that it offers a precise map for self-knowledge if you have the courage to use it. What bothers you most in others frequently points directly to internal work you still need to do. It's as if the universe placed mirrors around you, reflecting back aspects of yourself you're not yet ready to see directly. The question isn't to eliminate projection. It's an almost universal human phenomenon. The question is to develop enough consciousness to recognize when it's happening, both in you and in others. When someone criticizes you disproportionately, you can ask yourself, what pain is this person trying to externalize? And when you find yourself judging others with emotional intensity, you can question yourself, what aspect of myself am I avoiding confronting? We've reached the end of a journey that may have been more revealing than you expected. Throughout these 8 signs that Dostoevsky mapped through his most complex characters, you've not only learned to identify patterns of self-deception in others, but probably encountered uncomfortable reflections of your own humanity. And that's exactly the genius of the great Russian master. He never leaves us as external observers of the human condition, always forces us to recognize that we're part of this same universal tragedy. Quickly recapping, we saw how the compulsive need to justify everything reveals a mind at war with itself, how obvious contradictions can coexist when psychological architecture is built to keep truth separate, how small dramas serve to avoid facing larger existential questions, and how aggressive reactions to simple truths denounce exactly what the person most fears recognizing. We also observed how stories change according to conveniences to serve different emotional needs, how hunger for external validation reveals a profound internal void, how the inability to be alone with one's own thoughts is a sophisticated escape from self-exploration, and finally, how systematic projection of one's own flaws onto others is perhaps the most elegant and destructive self-deception mechanism of all. Dostoevsky taught us through decades of exploring the human psyche that, above all, don't lie to yourself. The man who lies to himself can easily stop distinguishing truth around him. This phrase isn't just moral advice, but a prophetic psychological warning. When we lose contact with our own internal reality, we also lose the ability to genuinely navigate the external world, transforming ourselves into characters in a theatrical play we wrote ourselves, but forgot we're the authors of. The practical application of this knowledge goes far beyond simply identifying patterns in others. It's about developing a more sophisticated form of emotional protection, one that isn't based on cynicism or distrust, but on compassionate understanding of human mechanisms of self-defense. When you recognize these signs, you're not gaining ammunition to judge or attack, but developing discernment to protect your own emotional energy and maintain more authentic and balanced relationships. But perhaps the deepest lesson emerging from this exploration is the need to turn our gaze inward. In which of these 8 signs did you recognize yourself? Where does your own psychological architecture still keep inconvenient truths separated in hermetic compartments? What small dramas do you create to avoid facing bigger questions about the direction of your life? When do you explode disproportionately in face of simple observations that touch wounds not yet healed? Self-deception isn't a moral failure, but a survival mechanism we all develop to some degree. The difference lies in the willingness to eventually confront these defenses when they begin to cost us more than they protect us. Some people spend entire lives trapped in elaborate theaters of self-illusion. Others develop courage to occasionally examine their own masks and make necessary adjustments to live with more authenticity. This week, observe a relationship through this new lens, not to judge or criticize, but to understand. When someone close begins to excessively justify a decision, when they explode at a simple truth, when they dramatize a small problem or project their own failures, remember that you're witnessing not evil or weakness, but a human way of dealing with pains that haven't yet found healthier forms of expression. Strategic compassion, understanding without being drained, observing without emotionally involving yourself in others' dramas, protecting yourself without becoming cynical, is perhaps the most valuable skill you can develop in this life. And it begins with recognizing that all of us at some level are fighting against versions of ourselves we haven't yet had the courage to completely integrate. Share in the comments which of these 8 signs resonated most with you and why. What patterns did you recognize in people close to you? What uncomfortable reflections did you find in yourself? Your experience can illuminate the path for someone still struggling to understand these complex dynamics of human nature. Because recognizing these patterns is just the first step. The real work of growth happens when we have the courage to apply this understanding not just to others, but mainly to ourselves.